Hey there, it's Mindy, and welcome to part 3 in my series of DIY tools for absolute beginners. In this one, we're talking about the table saw. Like the miter saw, the table saw has a circular blade, only this blade is mounted under a table. So this allows you to make longer, what are called rip cuts, so that's along the length of a board, and wider cross cuts. Let's talk about some parts of the saw. Let's start at the front of the saw. Of course, we have an on-off switch. Again, you can lock this for safety. This here on my saw is called the bevel or height wheel, and it turns to bring the blade up or down. And also, if I push it over, I have to unlock this, it can tilt the blade to make a bevel cut, which just is the blade tilted sideways. Again, this can look different on different saws. These measurements up top here are called the rip scale, and that's measurement from the blade to the fence to line up the width of your cut. This is the fence, which again just guides the piece and keeps it straight while you're cutting through. As far as the blade itself, again, these come in different diameters, but for a table saw, the wider the diameter, the deeper a cut it will make. So this is an 8¼ inch saw blade, and it'll cut up to 2½ inches thick. So for example, if you're just cutting wood that's 3/4 inch thick, a smaller diameter blade will do just fine. But if you're looking to cut something like a 4x4, you're going to need a larger blade. And the size of the blade is unique to whatever saw, so you'll have to think about that if you're thinking about purchasing a saw. Now, with any saw, of course, there are some safety features. This piece right here is called a riving knife, and that is attached behind the saw to keep the kerf, or the width that the blade is cutting through, open while it's cutting so that it doesn't pinch and get stuck. There's also a blade guard, which is this thing, and this is to keep the blade covered, prevent your fingers from getting too close, and that should always be on when you're making a through cut, and that means when the blade is going all the way through the depth of your cut. Attached to the blade guard are what are called anti-kickback pawls, and this is essentially a blade that will dig into the wood in the case of kickback, which means that your wood piece has gotten caught on the blade or it's pinched too tight, and essentially the blade is trying to push it back towards you. That's not a good thing, so these are to prevent that from happening. There's also some accessories. This is a push stick. Of course, you don't want to get your fingers too close to the blade, so this is to help push the piece through to get that cut all the way. And this is called a miter gauge, because you can make miter cuts on a table saw just like a miter saw, but in this case the gauge, let's see if I can, turns the piece of wood and the blade stays straight instead of the blade turning to that angle. Okay, so if I was going to make a rip cut, which again is along the length of the board, I want to measure the distance that I want. Go ahead and set up the fence lock it in place. Make sure my blade guard is on and the riving knife is up in position. Then start the blade, let it come to full speed, and push my piece through. Once this piece starts getting close to here, that's when I use my push stick to guide it the rest of the way through. If we are making a cross cut, which is along the width, we're going to use the miter gauge. So again, measure, mark, set up the gauge, align the piece, and you're going to hold the gauge with one hand and the piece with the other. Start the blade, let it come to full speed, and guide it through. Same thing if it's an angled miter or a bevel cut. So, quick recap on the table saw. It's another circular saw, but it is a blade attached under a table. It allows you to make rip cuts, which are along the length of a board, but you can also make cross cuts, miter cuts, and bevel cuts. As far as safety goes with the table saw, you definitely want to use the hearing protection, eye protection, but also a dust mask. This can kick up a lot more dust than a miter saw, and that's important to protect your lungs. Again, always refer to the safety rules in your manual. And one more important thing about the table saw is never use the fence with the miter gauge. That's a quick way to cause kickback. It's a no-no. So you either use the fence when you're making a rip cut or the miter gauge for cross cuts and other things. There are other ways to go about making a safer cross cut. I won't get into all that right now, but refer to your manual once again for those safety rules. Thanks for watching. DIY tools series for beginners. No.